Peace, y'all. It is I, Energy Master Allah, aka the Emma, and this is part 8, Decoding the Matrix. Again, if you haven't seen the other parts, make sure that you look around, check those out. They aren't as easy to find unless you are following the Energy Master Facebook page, where I share the lives as soon as I do them. Now, if you haven't noticed, Facebook is now erasing the lives after 30 days, but don't worry, I'm downloading these so I will have them to be able to, like, if I want to later, be able to edit them and put them into like a single, course or something like this. But I got a hard stop time limit today. I got about an hour and 45 minutes. I don't know if I get to everything that I want to talk about today, but if not, then I will stop so I can go pick up my daughter from school, and then I will continue later. She doesn't have any therapies or anything today, so I will have time afterward. But the pressing thing I wanted to make sure that I spoke with you about today is, okay, so this is a conversation that you may not have heard anywhere, or you may have heard bits and pieces of, but then naturally with these conversations, what we're doing is trying to bring pieces together, simplify it, because the key purpose is, one, to get you to a place where you're at least open enough to go through the steps that will be necessary in order for you to be able to see the actual nature of reality beyond what the average person has going on, beyond what we're told within the framework and the structure. And then I'll explain why that structure exists anyway, in a way that you likely haven't heard. And this will give you access to, I'll say more flexibility in figuring out how to solve the things that concern us most as human beings in the world. Put it that way, because one of my favorite examples that I picked up along the way was this idea of, well, basically when they're explaining to you how dimensionality work, how like multiple dimensions work. Where, let's say you have a rat in a maze, right? So you've seen that in the labs where they build these little mazes with the little walls, and you stick the rat in there, and you may put like cheese at the end of the maze, so you test for things to see how fast it can get through the maze, all of that sort of stuff like that. Well, you as the scientist, you're looking down on this maze. You know that there's nothing covering the top. Like, you could, if you wanted to, reach down into the maze, grab the rat, pick him up, carry him over all the walls, and put him right there where the cheese is, right? And so it's kind of like that. Like, what I'm describing is somewhat like that, in the sense that there's a relationship that we have with space and time that extends beyond the walls of the 3D reality we're at. And there's a reason that it works like that. And so, all barriers have the same underlying principle, which is evident from the word itself. So if you can use a word, like, I don't care what people say the meaning of something is, if you can use a word for multiple things, there is an underlying vibration associated with that word that connects all of those things. You having separate meanings for said word is itself the building of barriers of meaning between each one of those words. That's not to say it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just to say, in order for our reality to be organized the way that it is, we separate things into defined portions, even though it is simply an illusion that they are not connected. So, in other words, the only thing that holds up our perception of what we call reality is the ability for us to be able to ignore or otherwise not be able to sense the connection between things. It is a choice that we're making to be separate from things. And so this is the basis of how you have a physical reality, a physical body in the first place. This brings me to the etymology of the word completion. Okay, so completion, that word runs parallel to goodness and wholeness. A lot of these same words, it's the very essence of everything. So even in like Hindu, where they have like Vishnu, he's supposed to represent the Godhead, which is this essence of completeness, the all. So that which all things are made of is the essence from which all things are made of, right? So just get that as a concept. You don't have to believe in one thing or another. Just get that conceptually. We're dealing with things as words based on their usage as well as their etymologies. That's the freedom that we have in these conversations. Okay, so completeness. So that calm already, that deals with calm, code. That means together. So things are together, and so they depletion and complete. The best way to look at it is like a plane, like something flat. So it's like, so if I'm saying like if me and you are flat on the meaning of something, it means that we have a level understanding of what that thing is. We're seeing essentially the same thing. This is the equivalent of imagining you got a large barn on a farm and you painted each side of the barn a different color. So you have red on one side, yellow on this side, green on this side, blue on this side. And you have 4 people standing around it, one on each one of these sides. Now, if each person only looks at their side of the barn, their whole reality is that this barn is this particular color. The person that's looking at the red face thinks the whole barn is red. The person looking at the yellow side thinks the whole barn is yellow, and so forth. And so this is the way that our reality is separated between us, such that we're looking at the same barn, but we're seeing it from a different angle, and therefore our entire experience is more or less defined by that unique angle. Now imagine that same barn, except you've got 8 billion faces. That's basically what your face is as a human being. If you look at your face as one side of a 8 billion sided barn, then you have some conception of what it's like to be humanity as a whole. When you have some perception of your connection to humanity as a whole, you understand that the things that you do to burn your side of the barn has the danger of burning all sides of the barn. Likewise, you realize if I burn somebody else's side of the barn, I equally have as much of a chance of burning down my own side of the barn. So the vast majority of people who go about burning the world, they're doing so on the basis of a time measurement, which is to say, how long can I burn something combined with how far do I need to be away from that fire in order for me not to personally get burned, would personally not perceive myself to be burned. You see that distinction I made there, because the only thing that helps you to justify burning down somebody else's face of the barn is that you have the ability to perceive yourself as far removed from their side to where their fire will burn and probably extinguish before it ever reaches your side. So it may reach a few sides of the barn, but you have nestled yourself comfortably, significantly far away in your perception from that part of the barn to where you feel like you have not burnt yourself. So that's the underlying concept of human perception of reality. Now, here's where the problem comes in. Real estate. Okay, so you probably understand real estate from the perspective of, they buy and sell houses, they rent it to people, they buy commercial property. You understand it like that. If you know a little bit more, you get into the idea of chattel property, which is movable property. So there's a difference between fixed property that stays in one place versus those things that you can pick up and take somewhere else. And so you have this whole concept of ownership that is built around that should be your basic understanding of real estate. Now, so I would recommend that whoever you are, wherever you are, no matter what color you are, what country you're from, I would recommend everybody at some point in your life reading the trilogy written by author Richard W. Smith. It's a series, The Moor, The Mason, and The Alien. It's not to say you have to believe certain things, but what he has done is through studying the overall conversation, the different angles that people are coming at it with, from what is taught to us historically versus the histories that are preserved by certain marginalized groups. Over the past few decades, he's done a great job of putting a lot of those pieces within proximity enough of each other to where you can start kind of working your way through the murky waters and then getting an idea for what is the truth. Because there's a lot of people with great explanations out there. But for each of us, there is something missing from that conversation that is made up for by also engaging with other sides of the barn to get a more complete picture. Okay? And so that's, in a lot of ways, that's a lot more characteristic of today, because once upon a time, belief systems were so divided just in a cut and paste type of way that there was no openness to seeing whether or not there were connections. It was either I'm right or you're right. And if I'm right, you're wrong. Nowadays, it's still divided along some lines, even with, of course, the two-party system. It's designed to be divided. But even within that, you start to have some leaks where you start to realize, well, regardless of whether they're wearing red or blue, they got to go to the same office. The same way that you look at gangs, like you say, whether you wearing red or blue, you still got to live in the same city. So it's so you'll see performance like Kendrick's performance, where right now it ain't about red or blue, it's about Compton as a whole. You know what I'm saying? Like if everybody else is coming for Compton, then it doesn't matter what colors you got on, you band together. You can work out your differences later. And so similarly, something like that happens when you have a national threat and things of that nature. And because of the divisive nature of American politics to begin with, there is a motivation to create situations like a external conflict that bring both sides together in solidarity. It's a jacked up way. Like anytime you're dealing with an external solution, that's usually what it looks like, having to do something that scares you more than your current situation in order to get you to move. This is why being motivated from internally is so much more needed right now. Like, it's not to say that both things aren't necessary, but the thing that you usually want to address, the thing that you're lacking in the worst. And then what we're lacking in, really as a species, as humanity as a whole, is our internal estate. That brings us back to that real estate I was talking about. So we've got a huge desire and a huge attachment to the perception of external real estate. And so solution one, and then this is just you as the individual. Don't worry about the scaling just yet, because most of what I'm telling you, if you could get it on a personal internal level, you could scale it up. You could figure it out. Like, in fact, with many of the trainings that I've been involved with, initiations, things of that nature, it usually just involves you dealing with you and your internal state. And then if you're engaging with it in the proper way and going through the steps as you should, you naturally start seeing the connections between things around you. Like, you start, once you understand you and then you realize you're living with other human beings, you start to realize what are those common threads between us that I couldn't see before because I was mostly engaged with my individual situation. Then, once you understand how a unit of people, of multiple people within one home operate, you easily start seeing how that scales up into a neighborhood. Then from there, from a neighborhood to a state, to a country, to a planet, to a universe even. So you basically go through this scaling process where you realize that there's these same underlying mechanics, no matter how big you get and no matter how small you get. And once you break that barrier down, then it's just a matter of navigating through the language to see, okay, well, what are they calling it once I get to this level? And then once I get to this level, what are they calling it? But once you find that common link between it, you start getting a interdimensional perception of reality that allows you to be able to navigate into any arena, any space, any set of issues, and be able to identify vibrationally what needs to be corrected in a situation that will allow the reality that you're trying to build to even come into play. Okay. So typically with a conversation like this, you have to satisfy two key audiences that have been at odds for God knows how long. You've got the sciences, and you got religion. They don't care if there's connection between the two and what influence with. It's very easy to neglect and ignore connections between things if you either omit history or you fabricate history. In either paradigm, the two motivations are either spirituality or materiality. Materiality. There we go. Which is to say, you're either moving toward a paradigm where everything is connected, or you're moving toward a paradigm where nothing is connected. If nothing is connected, that gives you the opportunity to own real estate on a scientific basis. What this equates to is waves versus particles. As long as things are in wave form, they can be everywhere at once, and there's nothing to hold, there's nothing to keep. If it's in particle form, we're able to keep something in one place. Look at that thing. So when we're talking about objectivity, you're talking about making something an object so that you can study it and it doesn't change significantly within the time allotted, so that you can say, this is what this thing is, and it's not that thing over there. That's the basic premise of all science for the most part. Okay. And the word religion, of course, coming from again, and then the religion on there comes from legare, so to pull things together. Okay. So to bind something. So to bind or tie something together. Okay. So it is So there's in one direction, you can look into the past state of things and see how things are connected with regards to an origin. But what we're supposed to be doing with this type of, the whole purpose of us separating from the origin in the first place is that we're supposed to bring the bonds back together again. So that's what religion is. So religion is basically saying things were separated. Now I'm putting pieces back together. Now, this is where creativity comes into play, because depending on how you put that thing together, it's either going to be something that helps you more than your previous situation, or it's going to be something that hurts you in your current situation. It either helps you in your current situation or it hurts you. And so that's where the dilemma is, because depending on how you put things together, it determines whether it helps you or harms you. One of the things that we have covered and we have discussed at length is the fact that our seminal text in the West with regards to religion in America, even though there is variation, of course, there is no denying that basically the whole law of the land and the psychology of America is strongly rooted in Christianity, Protestant Christianity at that. So what we already know is that the version of Christianity that you ended up with here, even above and beyond being Protestant, because you also had the bending of things such that atrocities in this country like slavery could be justified. In addition to that, you've already got the starting matter of the fact that you only have 60 something odd books of the Bible, of a canonical Bible, whereas the Catholics have all the canon that you have plus about 10 more books. And then you take that and you have the Ethiopian Orthodox, which has all of the canon of those other two, but then has some other stuff that the other two don't have. Okay. And then you take into account that there were several other texts that are contemporary to these other ones that just did not fit the legation, the putting together, the binding that a particular group of people wanted to put together. So in other words, everybody got the same pieces to choose from for the most part. And so they're picking and choosing to say, okay, well, what structure are we going to put together for our particular Bible? All right. And so the reality that unfolds for that particular culture in that particular place has a foundation based on the choice of which things to bind and put together in terms of ideas. So there is a scaffolding, a foundation of an idea composed of ideas that have been bound together that creates the foundation before you ever build a physical foundation. And so this follows the same kind of structuring of the building of reality that you hear in like Egyptian, like mystery teachings and things of this nature, where they're talking about how, and this crosses over into quantum physics. So once again, like splitting hairs by saying these things are separate, but basically this idea of vibrations, these fluctuations, these disturbances in what we'll just call the space-time medium, because something has to be fluctuating, something has to be vibrating, right? Well, these vibrations weave together, coordinate, synchronize in ways that put together a specific type of structure. So we got these various things that we say, if we overlap them like this, it's going to limit the amount that it can move. And if I twist it like this, it's going to limit the amount it can move. And if I bend it like this, it's going to limit the amount it can move. And then once that happens, then we have the perception of something solid. So with this concept of completion that I was talking about before, this concept of solidity, of wholeness, it is banking on a type of agreement. So in other words, we talk about contracts being being binding. Likewise, you have a certain contract with third dimensional reality that says, I'm going to perceive this thing as flat and solid, and I'm going to perceive this range of things as wavy or otherwise. All right. So if you have that basic understanding under your belt, you'll basically be able to understand everything else I'm talking about. Your reality is entirely constructed from agreements that you made simply by being here. Like by being born human, your DNA dictates that your material body manifests in a particular type of way. It is affected in a particular type of way that another type of creature may not. Perfect example. I was just thinking about how, say for instance, a insect like a ant can crawl vertically up a wall. If you try to walk up that wall without some significant aid or above average ability, then you are going to fall back down to the earth flat on your back. This is a given. But we can say that what makes the ant be able to crawl vertically is that it's small, but it's a little more to that. See, when we look at a wall, we see a flat surface. Because of our size, our relationship with that wall relative to our size and the physical factors around us, like gravity and everything else, dictates that we see something that is more or less flat, smooth, vertical. From the size that an ant is, that surface is a lot less smooth and a lot less vertical. There's grooves, and in other words, it sees curves where we see something flat. So in other words, it has an entirely different relationship with the reality of that wall than you do. In fact, it may see it as a series of flat planes connected in a certain way, and it's just walking up them like steps. So just like how we would get over the limitation of being able to move up a building that's tall by, instead of trying to walk up the wall, we build steps that circumambulate, that go around that particular structure, that tower, that wall, whatever it may be. Okay, so they see stairs where you see a wall. That's a good bar for you to, transform into some self-help or motivational stuff right there. Like you've got to see stairs where everyone else sees walls. Like if I was one of those guys and my whole motivation was getting you pumped so I could get your money or something like that, that's how I would word it. But instead, I'm sitting here on a Thursday presenting it to you in terms of the tangible physical reality that you're in. And the reason being is, most of the stuff that allows those who we look at as authorities or rulers or whoever else, all of that authority is centered on the basis of them being able to get you to subscribe to an idea that there is a wall where there could be stairs, right? There's a wall, a flat surface blocking you where there could be stairs for you to be able to get over it. Look at a map. So after you get off of here, look up a map, and then just type in like world map countries so that you can see the different borders between the countries. One thing that you will never, ever, 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 ever see is a round political border. I say specifically political border because that is distinct from a natural border. You have some countries where part of their political border coincides with natural borders that are typically formed by bodies of water. In most cases, in some cases, it might be mountain ranges or something like that. But for the most part, states, countries, political borders are flat until they reach something like a river. So you'll see like the shape of like the northern part of China or the southern part. So the northern part is more associated with like rivers and or mountain ranges, which gives it that kind of curved shape. The bottom right side of China is a little more curved because it's on the ocean. But if you look at the inland countries and things of that nature, they have a more or less straight type of cutting for what's their border, where does it stop, where does it begin. And that's necessary because then you'll have wars and semantics over somebody stepping on 1 inch of land that belongs to the other country because it's jagged and they can't tell the difference. That's how they cut that out. But once again, if you look at this land from space, you do not see those country borders, those state borders drawn, because it is not something natural. It is an idea that is preserved in our laws. So a reduction that you can apply to your perception of reality as a whole is that you can only own something if it is flat, if it is square. In fact, this is where the word real comes from. So the word real comes from the same root as royalty, and thus realty. In addition, you can add regal. So regal is another word for royalty. Well, it comes from the same word as regulate. So the regal body is who regulates the country. So this comes from alignment. This comes from basically making something straight that was once curved. Why is that? Because in geometry, technically, a curved surface or curved border is infinite because you can break it down into an infinite amount of points. It doesn't come to a hard point. You have something that's called hyperbolic geometry, which is in contrast to the linear geometry that we look at. So you look at a square and it has this flat sides, flat, 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 flat. They come to a point, that point is equal to 0 and flat, square. Well, in hyperbolic geometry, those lines are curved. So like if you look at one of those, what's a good example? Like a curved little shape, like if you got like the little twinkle emoji on your phone, what's got the curves, the 4-pointed curve star thing, you know what I'm talking about. Well, technically, the points on that thing, they point toward infinity. So on a square, those lines point toward 0 at those points. In hyperbolic geometry, where those curves are, those points go on into infinity. Now that's drastically different. And the reason that's important is because, like I said before, you have the ability to perceive things as solid, or you perceive them as waves. You perceive them as ownable, or you perceive them as not ownable. If it's not an object, I can't own it, really. Even with an idea, the only way that you can even conceptualize owning an idea is that you have a piece of paper that you and somebody else are agreeing represents that idea. The idea isn't on the paper. Is writing that represents. So you can own symbolism. So in that regard, symbolism is a type of real estate. This is the way that we end up with intellectual property. So by symbolizing an idea in a tangible format, there is an agreement that you make with society that this thing that's symbolizing this idea represents my ownership thereof. So this extends the reach of real estate into the realm of your thoughts. And that's where the problem comes along. Because once we allow people to take up real estate in our heads, I know that's part of the popular vernacular nowadays, but that's literally what you're doing right there. So you've basically allowed something to symbolize an otherwise intangible concept, and by agreeing to the reality of that symbolism, you're also giving yourself agency to react to that thing as if it is physically real. So you can have an emotional reaction to somebody taking an idea for that reason. If we're looking at things as they are, we realize that you can't own an idea because we all scoop from the same pool of influences and waves and everything else, this whole soup of creation. We're all dipping into it, and the idea is available to all of us, and it's just a matter of who's utilizing it right now. And so because of that, so that we don't have conflict, we created systems by which we can say, well, I can use this idea exclusively for X amount of time. Just like it's both our bike, we'll just keep it at my house. Hey, you saw Debo turn around and punch Red in the eye, but it's basically that same concept, right? And so even with copyright law, there is a limit on how long you can own that idea before it becomes what's called public domain, and anybody is able to freely use that idea. Your claim, your stake of claim with that thing then becomes solely associated with your unique spin on that thing. What you did uniquely to make that thing famous is what you have ownership of, because that history is undeniable. But you also run into the problem of, if that history is not recorded and it's not remembered and it's not respected, then you no longer have any claim to it. And so you can already kind of hear how that kind of happens with a lot of our stuff, where folks that look like me have been around so long that there's things that we have owned, used, whatever else, to the point where it's just public domain. And then you have other people who come along, who develop newly, who have isolated and created a new identity for themselves, who then come in and try and grab from the public domain, do something with it, and then you get into the semantics about who this belongs to, who it doesn't belong to, and really the anger stems from acknowledgement. So it's not so much that one set of people who were here first don't want you to be able to use something, so much as they want to be acknowledged for having made it possible for you to be able to use that thing in the first place. Peace, cuz. I see you. So a lot of the conflicts, if you really think about it, come down to ownership and the idea of having had something so long that it becomes public use, and then the person who had it originally wanting to at least be acknowledged for the contributions that they put in on that thing. So you can, if you really look at all the conflicts throughout human history, it's somewhere in there, and it all ties back to this concept of reality, realty, royalty that I'm talking about right now, which is to say everything in the universe is connected. This is a fact, but in order for us to have an individual identity, a perception of reality that is unique to what a human being is, we had to make an agreement with reality, which is to say that this is what we're going to perceive as being flat, solid, tangible, and then this is what we're going to let just be loose. Because there's all sorts of stuff flying around you. There's all sorts of stuff flying around this room right now that we can't even feel. All this air, there's all these particles, all this stuff that's in here. But we have an agreement based on this physicality that says that this hand will easily pass through this air. We have a slightly different agreement with water. If my hand is passing through water, it's going to behave differently. We have a different relationship with this wall over here. My hand is not going to pass through it. I'm not going to pass through this floor. I've made an agreement that I do not want to pass through the floor. I like it how it is, right? Okay. So that's what's holding and propping up the entire world. So this also means, once again, that the people who control you, who control your society, who control your planet, largely are able to do so because, as opposed to simply staking claim to the physical real estate, they had to convince you that certain things are tied to specific locations or a specific book or just something physical in order to get you to believe that somebody else owns that thing. They did that with your spirituality. They've done that with your identity. All of these sorts of things that are simply ideas, not to say they're not important ideas, but the problem is what they bound that idea to. And once again, one of the reasons I'm telling you to read that trilogy by Richard W. Smith, The More, the Mason, and the Alien, is because he's done an excellent job of really weaving together the tangible, the spiritual, the esoteric aspects of it so you can see how these things have all moved together. And most importantly, because he is one of the few people telling that story while not omitting the one piece that brings all of it together, which is us, which they would refer to as the Moorish legacy. So you can get into all the semantics about, the Moors versus the Black Israelite, whatever you may call it. But then basically we're talking about a blanket term that's associated with a specific spiritual influence that is basically that thing underneath the surface that connects all of us regardless of where our location is. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it also extends to white people. So we have taken a stance that becomes exclusive in a sense when it comes to our identity, but it has more to do with an overall, we'll say, species identity first. But naturally, we had subdivisions and changes that happened in them. And so, based on how Richard, and then mind you, if I'm sharing something that Richard or anybody else said, it's because it was something that was already kind of aligned with what I was looking at, and I'm exploring their ideas as a means for seeing how they organized it and things of that nature. Because like there's certain things that he didn't bring into it or look at that I know he couldn't have because of his personal experiences. He just wouldn't have come across it. And then likewise, there's certain things from his personal experiences that I wouldn't have come up with just sitting around here or whatever. So this is the kind of interplay and intercourse that happens between thinkers and seekers and explorers, whereas we have to accept one that everybody's work is our own, and at the same time our own work belongs to everybody. This is the core of the word permission, which is to move under. So you can look at it as already being connected in a quantum way anyway. But it's a matter of us having free will and free choice as well. And so that's where the heart comes in. So our heart and soul play this role of intermediary, where we have the option to determine what we say belongs only to us versus what belongs to the universe. And the more that you give and you permit with regards to the universe, the more you have access to. So naturally, it's like, hey, if I'm giving this much, then I can get this much. It's a exchange like that. All right, and that scale, that value scale, isn't really for you to determine. Like there's natural structures and barriers and measures in the structure of the actual reality itself, such that it knows the value of things. It's not something that you have to try to think of. Okay, and then we turn around, we call that physics, or we call that, science and stuff like that. But that's essentially what it is. It's a value system that you don't really have to put a lot of thought into. Now, when you talk about the value system of our economy, that's something that a bunch of people had to sit down and say, I want it to cost this much and for this reason and blah, blah, blah. It has to be propped up on their reasons and their agreements. Okay, and then on some level, some spiritual level, you can look at even this physical reality as a set of agreements that you made on the other side as spiritual beings. Okay, so how is this valuable to you? So your relationship with the material world, because you've been put in a position where you have to get a job, you have to get money and a place to live. There's just so many considerations. There's legal considerations. There's places that you can't go. There's places you can go. There's somebody who determines that. And so it's basically all broken down and compartmentalized such that you got one set of rules when you appear, and it breaks down into a more localized set of rules, This is the same thing that your body does. It all deals with entropy. So entropy is this notion that you start with something simple, like a singularity in the universe, and then it expands and it gets gradually more and more complex and more complicated as time progresses. So you go from everything being this one material, one thing, to gradually expanding into all the stuff you see now. That's the basic concept that we apply to time. Okay. Now, that which I just described is just as easily performed and completed by having something small like a seed and it growing into something complex like a tree. Or you can have a substance that is everywhere, and then different parts of that substance are localizing based on a certain process, such that this pool of what originally seemed connected with everything, it now looks like it has separate parts. But all that's happening is it's saying I'm lowering my entropy, I'm simplifying, I'm lowering how complex I am in one place, which makes it more complicated somewhere else. The more chaotic, the more complicated it is, the less you're going to be able to interact with it in a solid and steady form, which is why my hand can move through the air like it is. All these particles that are making up this air are so chaotic, so complicated and spread, and it's just so much going on with them that they move out the way. They just don't have any stability to just stay in one spot, and my hand is able to move through them. By comparison, my hand is more solid, it is more organized, it has less entropy. How do I keep it that way? I have to eat. So when I'm eating, I'm taking something that is compact, simple, relatively, and then when I chew it up and I swallow it and my cells break it down, it has now made that simple ball of something far more complicated, spread out into far more different places of the body. And this is entropy. So you're basically eating low entropy. So you eat something, you're eating its organization and breaking it down so that your body can be more organized. Now, naturally, there's limitations to that because you also have a kind of global entropy, an agreement that you have with Earth, such that you're only going to be here physically for so much time because the materials you're made of have those agreements are going to be here in that particular form for so long. And so we look at that as growth and aging and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's basically entropy. And so your society does the exact same thing. So by compartmentalizing, instead of it just being this one thing that breaks down at a particular rate, it can extend its life by lowering the entropy in one place while increasing it elsewhere. So anywhere that there is wealth gathering in one area is going to create chaos everywhere else within that system. Isn't that a perfect description of what you see right here in America, what you see in the world? So you have rich people, their resources concentrate in one spot, which causes there to be either a lack or scattering of resources everywhere else. So there is a clear correlation between organization and low entropy, low chaos. So what we look at as peace, which is the absence of chaos, is essentially orderliness that is facilitated by bringing simplicity and organization into something that is otherwise disorganized and chaotic and separated. If you understand that concept, you realize the value of becoming organized, orderly, having a specific set of rules. Once again, that rule is a regulation, which is basically creating flat borders on what you can and cannot do as an agreement between each other. And we form this contract that says this is how we're going to interact with each other. And from there, we're able to build a organization. So the key word within that is organized. So that's where your peace comes from. This is why countries sign peace treaties. It's a piece of paper that symbolizes the idea of them not blowing each other up. This is where you hear the pen is mightier than the sword. Because the clashing of swords typically happens in a more chaotic environment, war-torn environment. And so long as there is chaos, there is no organization and can be no peace. And so there is no stable outcome for that. It's only when everybody's blown each other up or you don't have anybody else to blow up that it becomes stable again, because now your organizing principle is the only thing that's present. So basically, the human idea right now of peace is, let me destroy everything that does not fall into my group's organizing principle, and therefore nothing will be disorganized. Well, I mean, that's the type of thinking of, like, you know, wild animals. Like it's like there's no humanity in that. Like you don't have to do a lot of thinking in order to have that kind of, conclusion that, oh, all I have to do is get rid of everything that's not like us, and then we'll be at peace. Well, the problem is, due to the way that human perception works, wherever you're not able to perceive something as significantly different from yourself, you will start nitpicking at slight differences between you and whoever's within your proximity. So this is how, when in a hood where you have people that aren't really going outside of their neighborhood, instead of being in conflict with another ethnicity, nationality, whatever else, they clash among themselves. So you have people who live on the same, set of blocks that are fighting with and killing each other because they have no one else to look at as different from themselves. So you'll see, so long as your mindset is of otherness, it doesn't matter what color you are, where you live, what country, whatever else, what planet, it doesn't even matter. So long as you have a concept of otherness, you can project otherness onto things, and you become primarily self-serving. Okay. So the other paradigm, once again, is the idea of all things being connected. So you understand that by me hurting something else or someone else, I'm hurting myself. Now, that also means that a lot of people think that means that you just neglect your own needs and you just do for everybody else. No. There's a difference between doing for yourself out of the perception of otherness and separation versus doing for yourself with respect to your connection to everything. Because there's plenty of people, mentors and different people I've had. I adopted a lot of that ideology, but they have this understanding that by taking care of their health and continuing to do the kind of work or creative endeavor or whatever it is that they do, it's providing opportunities, protection, resources for everybody around them. Like, you're keeping yourself organized such that the people around you have at least one thing that is stable and doesn't change around them. So it's like you become like a sun in their solar system, right? So as you can see, you don't necessarily need a physical location in order to be the center of something. Look at, yes, there are physical churches and there are, physical pastors or whatever else when it comes to religion, when it comes to Christianity. But like in the case of Christianity, the thing that holds all of it together, the common ground, is Jesus. And so naturally what you saw happen with Protestantism and the different denominations is that when you had something in common, all you got the same Jesus, you figured out ways to have different Jesuses. So if there was one person that lived who was named Jesus, if there was, you can clearly see that from church to church to church to church to church to church to church, everybody is essentially looking at a different side of the same barn. Because if you understood what he was trying to teach you in the first place, you'd understand that you have that same thing within. You need not look any further than within for that spark, that Christ, if you will. And by activating that spark within you, it helps to direct your will and your awareness in such a way that the way that you interact with the world around you becomes Christ-like, in the definition that you popularly understand. Okay, hold on. Okay, 1:30. Give me just a second. Let me go do something about this this AC. Cause I got to switch it over. Florida is schizophrenic this week, where it's like 40 something in the morning and then 80 in the afternoon, and it's starting to get toward that 80 stage. So give me just a second. Be right back. I'll be right back. Don't stop till you get enough. Keep up. Don't stop. Don't stop till you get enough. Keep up. Beautiful. Don't stop till you get enough. Keep up. Beautiful. Don't stop. Don't stop till you get enough. All right, I'm back. Anyways, so that's that. So we got a basis. Okay, so what is all of this propped up on? Like really. If reality is such that everything is connected, you can't really own curved things. So nobody owns the earth, quote unquote, but they own little squares of the earth by carving it out and saying, okay, well, this is flat enough in my perception to where you can't own. Like if you can see the curvature of something, you technically can't own it. Like by those just geometric rules that I've been talking about. So how do you gain control or ownership of something? You have to have a way to perceive it as flat. And how do you do that? Okay. So remember I told you there's a difference between linear geometry, the stuff you're used to, versus hyperbolic geometry that's based on the curves. Hyperbolic geometry is based on seeing things from the perspective of light itself. So if you're standing on a sidewalk and I pass you in a car, in my perception, you appear to be going backwards as I'm going forward. Likewise, I look like I'm going the opposite direction from you. From the perspective of light, these two things are happening at the same time. And what is basically saying is, regardless of which direction you're heading, light will behave the same way and have the same speed. This is what facilitates both of you having a shared experience. So you are not seeing something individually so much as you both are one thing, and you are then only processing one half of that experience as yourself. So you and one other person having different perspectives of the same one situation is essentially one light that is experiencing itself from two angles simultaneously. So if you can think the way that light thinks, this is how you bridge that gap. So in hyperbolic geometry, the reason that two lines don't converge and become zero like it does with linear geometry is because you understand this to be like two parallel lines that are so far out that they seem to come together on the horizon. Like when you're looking at the road, when you're driving and you're on the road, you know you have two parallel sides to this road. But if you look far enough down to the horizon, it looks like it comes to a point. You know, because you done been driving forever, that it doesn't really come to a point. It just looks like it comes to a point, and that once you get down a little further, it's going to open up. So imagine that you're something that has the ability to get both infinitely big and infinitely small. If you are able to get infinitely small, there's nothing that seems to be coming to an end. There's nothing that looks like, if you see two lines coming together, I don't care what it is, it doesn't look like it's ending right there to you. It's just a matter of how much smaller do I have to get in order for that to go on forever? So if you imagine that light is doing that, it looks like nothing, either nothing is connected or everything is connected. Everything is parallel to each other in that hyperbolic kind of sense. Right? So you will always, if that's the case, if you're one of those lines, you can't own anything but yourself. Like you never really interact with anything. So as a spiritual being, you are essentially a hyperbolic soul. That means in order for you to experience eternity, infinity, those types of things as a soul, you have a hyperbolic relationship with everything. You are your own thing. You're your own unique experience. When we put the ability to perceive curvature in the mix, where it looks like things come together, well, we have continuity, or let me scratch that. So continuity of your existence as an eternity is facilitated by curvature. So the ability to curve and perceive things hyperbolically. We look like we're coming in at each other, but then we curve outward. Our ability to see intersection between things and perceive things as intersecting is how you build blocks in separation. Okay, that's what we're getting at. So our ability to perceive intersection is what gives us the ability to perceive a physical reality. And in order, intersection just means to cross. So wherever we heard that word, cross, Christ, crucifix, whatever else you want to associate with Christ, that's associated with that. Okay, there's other breakdowns of that etymology that deal with growth and even a young animal, which are very interesting. And that's where you get into that stuff about the lamb and whatever else. But case in point, we have the ability to perceive ourselves as intersecting with things as opposed to having hyperbolic individuality, and in such having eternal continuity. And so it is that ability to perceive the relationships, to be able to translate between that hyperbolic existence into a shared existence, is ultimately what consciousness facilitates. So the experience of consciousness is one that fluctuates between this experience of nothing is separated to everything is separated. And we as humans are the integration of the two. We have the ability, because of our soul, to be able to perceive both eternity and the idea of things being solid and connected at the same time. This is what it's always been about. So you had something that was everything and therefore experiences itself as connected to nothing else. Then you have this state where it seems like everything is connected and that there are multiple things that can be connected. So once we get to that level where we can experience ourselves as separate on one level, but connected to everything in another level, it keeps things from collapsing into one or the other, and it gives us an experience with infinite possibility. So possibility is the child that comes out of those two things and being integrated with each other. Because now it's a matter of, okay, I've got everything possible to work with. And now it's just a matter of how do I uniquely want to fit those pieces together. I might not build my Legos the same way that the next person builds their Legos. And that gives me something enjoyable. Something that may not be enjoyable to somebody else. But that's what this whole thing is about. Now, what happens when somebody says, oh, you have to build your Legos the way I'm building my Legos? or there's going to be penalties and you won't even get the opportunity to build Legos anymore. That is essentially what slavery is. And just based on that explanation I just gave, it already becomes clear that this is a more psychological type of barrier than it is a physical barrier, because what you perceive as real physically beyond certain limitations is ultimately determined by your psychology regarding that thing. Do you see a wall or do you see stairs? Do you see a door or do you see a window? Or do you see a wall? Once again, this is not denying whatever types of agreements you made with physical reality that says that your hand isn't going to pass through this wall when you push on it. But that isn't to say that there aren't certain people, certain masters, who have found ways to circumvent or even alter their contract with reality, such that something that was once a limitation, they have earned through initiation the ability to pass through some of those typical barriers. And then so that is essentially what we're describing and we're looking at when we talk about these Christs that come into being. And one story, even though it is woven together a few stories in order to make a super story, these are the type of individuals that we're talking about. These ones who have, by whichever means, either they have established or renegotiated their contract such that they now have accesses to higher forms of their dimensionality, such that they can choose to interact directly with this 3D reality or not. If you're not interacting directly with space in this physical reality, then you may still be able to interact with time. So the timing of events, the way things that unfold, you might be able to put some ripples in that, and then it causes those living in the physical spatial reality to still end up in certain circumstances and things of that nature. So when you talk about like spiritual influences or things that steer you either in a good way or a bad way, that's what we're talking about. You're basically impacting the timing of things on a more electromagnetic level, if you will, such that people, they will have ideas that they think are their own, but it's really inspiration, and they in turn perform physical actions on behalf of that which influenced them in the first place. Now, that is, like I said, it's not always a bad thing. It's not always a good thing. You are the intermediary, so at the end of the day, you have the final say on what you do and don't accept. And you know that there are some things that are easier for you to accept than others. So it then becomes your job to strengthen yourself spiritually such that you have the final say on any and all potential influences from ideas. If you establish that, that is the sole meaning of owning your real estate. So you, as a sole owner of your reality, okay? Sole owner of your soul begins with you recognizing that aspect of your real estate, your ruling body. Okay, you don't need to own nobody else's. This hyperbolic type of existence and ownership is central to the concept of the Temple of Solomon, because you have been told, taught, and convinced that the Temple of Solomon was a single physical location that a specific group of people own and operate, and as a result, you have not been able to access it, even though it is everywhere, particularly as it relates to you. So, Rick Smith, he gives a pretty good explanation with regards to the association of the process by which sound generates light and how your body serves as a medium for that process. And this is ultimately the underlying process associated with enlightenment. So what does that awaken within you by you being able to, and this is from experience, this ain't just from hearsay, this is from actually being in that state where I was connected enough with the experience of my own completion, my own wholeness, that my mind was able to gain insight into the wholeness of the universe. And as a result, the mind basically switches in a certain way to where you become receptive to all things. So it's like, so a large part of the reason we see reality the way we do normally is because we discount certain things. Like we see one thing is real and this thing is not real. Well, in my perception, as a result of my initiations and revelations that have come from that, is that everything is real. It's just a matter of how the probabilities and the possibilities are being wielded such that a contract with reality can be made such that that thing would be real. And some things have more bargaining chips than others based on certain conditions, but it is very conditional. It is not as hardwired as we are led to believe. I put it that way. Okay, so if you've been watching the other videos, I've really been diving into how the golden ratio and everything else relates into this. And so, in fact, I think this idea right here is what I'm going to end with on this one before I get into the codes in part 2, which I will do later today, God willing. That's just a way of me saying, if circumstances are such that I feel like doing it later on, but I want to do it. And as long as another priority that I have committed to doesn't interfere with that, then I will be doing it a little bit later in a couple hours. Okay, but before I go, what I want to give you is, so that same relationship between the curve and the straight, the wave and the particle, extends to the irrational and the rational. You probably more often hear those words with respect to something that doesn't make sense versus something that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, we say that's irrational. If it does make sense, yes, that is rational thinking right there. What that really is from a mathematical standpoint, if we say that something is rational, that means that I can make that number. So if it's a number that has like a long repeating decimal or doesn't repeat at all, it just keeps going on forever, then I could say that's irrational. That's an irrational number. Like there's nothing that I can divide by or whatever else that'll give me that number. It's an irrational number. Well, I'll tell you that back. There's no two numbers I can divide in order to get there, because there's like equations you can, using other non-terminating numbers in order to make that or whatever else. But as far as two integers go, two simple numbers that I can divide to get that, it's a no-go. So it's irrational. By contrast, a rational number is thus something I can get by dividing two integers. So essentially, all integers are rational because I can divide them by 1 and get that same number. So by the identity property of 1, all integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of that stuff is rational relative to 1. Technically anything, if you put it that way, but what we have in the case of the golden ratio, which is 1.61803397, so on and so forth, is an irrational number that is informing just about everything in our reality without itself being rational in our reality. So accompanying the golden ratio, we have what's called the Fibonacci sequence, which I've talked about countless times throughout these videos. And you can look that word up, Fibonacci sequence, if you've never heard it before. But this same pattern, in most things that grow, there is some relationship with the Fibonacci sequence, such that, like in the spiral of a seashell, certain proportions of your body, it allows something to go from a simple state to a more complex state over time under a specific rate. The Fibonacci numbers, this sequence of numbers, I can take a number and the one that's before it in its sequence, and it will give me an approximation of the golden ratio. The further I go into this sequence, the bigger the numbers get. So if I'm starting out somewhere around 3 divided by 2, that gives me 1.5, which is kind of close to the golden ratio, but not as close as it would be if I get all the way down to like 89 divided by 55, where now we start to get like 1.618 something. Okay, so the further I go down the line, the bigger these numbers get. It's basically a relationship between two. You can look at it as a relationship between two things, that the more complex each of them gets, while still being compatible with each other, the closer they get to perfection, quote unquote, with the golden ratio. So you can apply that same principle to male and female in a relationship, whereas two partners in a relationship. So I've got these two lines that are doing complicated stuff or whatever else, but if they are the exact right alignment to each other, they basically are perfect for each other. So that means that the way our reality works in 3D, because to say it's 3-dimensional means there's 3 parts to it. So mother, child, parent. Mother, parent, father, mother, child. A father and a mother, they come together, and there is the perfect alignment of conditions that allow a child to come forth. So as you know, with people who have a lot of trouble conceiving a child, those two parts aren't compatible. If a child results, then you say, okay, there's a level of compatibility there. We've got to... Now, even if you have a child, there can be all sorts of things that can go wrong. There can be defects and different stuff like this. And then that weighs on the compatibility as well, in certain ways, certain genetic compatibilities. But case in point, if you can bring life into the world, there's a compatibility between your parts. Well, let's put it this way. If you put a man part together with a woman part, it's compatible at least enough to have a likelihood of producing a child. Whereas if I put a man part with a man part or a woman part with a woman part, the likelihood of that producing a child without any other significant action or activity or outside interference of some sort is very, 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 very slim. Okay, so there's certain built-in compatibilities with this reality. All right, and then if that's there, then you have to assess that there must be some reason for that. Okay, and so you have this kind of relationship going on with the Fibonacci sequence versus the golden ratio. And so it is within that relationship that you begin to understand what's meant by the idea of us living in a simulation. We are not living inside a computer generated world. We are in a world for which computers are a simulation. Let me say that again. Even though it works in a way that reminds us of being inside of a computer simulation, it is actually the computers that are the simulation of how this reality works. So the computers can be seen as a rationalization of how the universe itself works anyway. It's just a very, very more infinitely complex version of that no computer that we ever build will ever reach. However, we can create technology that is significantly... All right, let me put it this way. You as a human being, you are probably the most complex technology in the universe in its organized form. So you are the most organized, complex thing in the universe. You have the perfect balance between these two things. And as a computer, what you're doing is you are sacrificing certain degrees of freedom such that certain operations can be more organized. So that's to say, you take out all these emotions and these other variables and so on and so forth, and you are able to have the computer do something more reliably than it would have been able to do before that for a particular purpose. And then in doing so, it becomes a tool. You, as the human being, have the ability to change the simplicity or complexity around how you perceive something such that you can be a perfectly useful tool when you go to work and you say, I'm going to be organized and I'm only going to limit myself to these amount of actions. As opposed to you going out, getting drunk, dropping your inhibitions on Friday and just being a whole wild card. Don't nobody know what you're going to do. And for that reason, they may look at you as fun until it gets too chaotic and people get hurt. Then it's like, nah, I think you got a problem. You probably need to go get organized, go get some rehab, yo. And so this is the dance of human psychology in which we determine when we want to be more organized and when we want to be more chaotic, and then finding that balance. And it's because of that ability to be able to modulate that balance that we have an experience of free will. And even though it itself is a distortion of the true reality, which is to say that all probabilities, all possibilities are accounted for on some level, and it is that perfect level of accounting that is the backbone of everything that exists. So if you think of it as this one substance that permeates everything, in that sense, there is some organization. But because that complete organization also facilitates the nature of complete disorganization, these two things become complementary parts of a whole that are inseparable. Like you have to have both the chaos and the peace. We are able to, on an individual level, experience a stable, peaceful life that we introduce and modulate what levels of chaos we're willing to accept. As a result, that is only possible if you are connected to both of those things. If you have both the agent of ultimate chaos and the agent of ultimate order within you, and you have the best probability, best shot of getting the balance of those two things that you want within you with virtually no chance out here. The balance that you create within yourself of those two forces, the peace and the chaos, you can call them whatever you want, and they've been called several things. Some people say God versus devil or whatever else. Both aspects are within you, and the mixture that you compose of those two things, because you got to have some of it. Now, if God wanted the devil to just disappear and it just be gone, it wouldn't be no devil. There's a perfect balance of one or the other once you understand them enough to have that permission to say, okay, well, I got to, like, I want to be a good person and everything else, but I still got to go pay these bills. And then, but now I get to decide whether I'm going to make that money doing something I can sleep well after I get off of doing it, or I'm going to lose sleep because I'm doing something that doesn't agree with who I really am. And so that mixture, that balance, that's essentially what we call emotions. Emotions give us that option to change the mixture between these two primary forces and get something that illuminates us. And I use that specific word because after initiation must come illumination, which then leads to revelation. It gives you the light to see. Light itself is a combination of electric fields and magnetic fields moving in unison. So even light has the same property that I was just talking about, a masculine and feminine, where you have two things that on one level run parallel and never touch, but are able to have a shared experience by also having a complementary curve. And this is why I could justify this in several ways, but this is me saying this. That's why the letter U is shaped the way that it's shaped, like kind of like a magnet. It's this idea of you have these two parallel lines coexisting with a curve connecting the two of them. And so U is universe in the supreme alphabet. And then I would personally, from my expertise, say that that's probably part of the reason. Like, I don't know if that was the thought when it was done, but that is definitely something I would add on to that. That the simultaneous experience of two things being parallel, however, also being able to experience ourselves as a third possibility of connection between two things in a quantum way. So we experience ourselves physically separate, but universally connected through the quantum realm. That's what the universe is. And we can get into the physics and all that another time. But the point is, this idea of extremes is limiting our ability to maneuver where we have to adopt a paradigm of complementarity. If you want to look at the science definition of that or whatever, you can look up Niels Bohr, chemistry dude, physicist dude, and this notion that there are certain properties that can't be measured at the same time for a single object. Like if something is in motion, I can't also measure its position because its position is in constant change. If it stops, I can measure its position, but now I can't measure its motion because it's not moving anymore. So we have these same types of relationships that we have to be able to quantum perceive, which is to say, I understand how those two things can exist at the same time on some level. They may be disconnected in my perception as far as time goes, but if I have a single story and in the beginning of the story, this thing is moving, at the end of this story, this thing has stopped. Within the context of the whole story, that thing is both moving and stopped at the same time as far as the whole book goes. As I break that book down into individual pages and parts, yeah, there's a part where it's moving and there's a part where it's not. But in the scope of the whole book, which I can hold in my hand, both of those things happen at the same time. So in other words, your birth, life, and death are all in superposition outside of third dimension. So you only perceive them as separate slices of moments because of how 3D works. But just like that rat that I talked about, where you can reach in through the top, pull them out, and then put them up by the cheese, that is exactly what your spirituality is supposed to be accessing, such that your soul, when you're asleep, it is doing some form of working out your psychological situation in dream form. It's actually going to certain fields of information to work out certain things, such that your actions that you take to justify the new reality that you want are taken by you in slices that we call moments and steps. So in other words, that thing that you were looking at as a wall has some version of reality where there are steps. And that is what your soul is doing when you are dreaming. When you have an out-of-body experience, now instead of your soul doing that on autopilot based on the impulses that you have accumulated through your karma and action throughout life, you can actually consciously take the wheel and do that in real time. You can interact with time, you can interact with space in a certain type of way. But like I said, in the waking reality, that thing is subjected to growth, which is modulated by the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence. It's a translation that happens between those two things, such that the reality that you set into motion on the other side unfolds here within the rules and limitations that have been set on this construct, this place. And so I think that's enough. That is a basis, because in part 2 of this, I'm going to actually start giving you the codes, because just like any good computer program, there is code. And if you know how to look at the code and identify what this line of number or code or symbols is saying, then you have more opportunity to be able to set your sails. There is not to say you have to change the code so much as changing your psychology around it determines how your story plays out, which is to say the timing of events will shift in the physical reality such that certain synchronicities and other things that you need in order to prop yourself up, like your job, like you getting that new job is propped up on the series of events that led to you having the education and training necessary in order to qualify for that job. So that is to say, each one of those moments is like a brick that you added to a building that needed, it was added to a staircase. You were building a staircase. Each one of those was a step that allowed you to reach the door to that job that you wanted. So you're just doing that exact same thing, except you don't have to rely entirely on this 3D material reality. There's certain steps that you can take that will cause synchronicities to unfold in this reality and have you in the right place in physical reality to take the right action. I've done this multiple times. That's how I met George Clinton. That's how I met Wu-Tang. Like, I would usually do it with music. Like, I would engage with the music in such a way to where, like, for instance, the first and only acid trip I've ever had with some friends in Georgia, there was a moment in there, like, I remember everything from that day except for this one period of time where I, like, completely gone. But they said that I told them to put on a specific song. It's a specific Wu-Tang song, specific verse. And I kept telling them to play it over and over. When I woke up, when I came back to when I was conscious, I was performing this song. Like, I'm talking about, like, word for word. And so apparently I had done this a couple of times. So when they say you know something in your sleep, like, I knew this verse enough to where I could perform it in my sleep. And my takeaway from the experience was that a higher aspect of myself, like, I was drifting consciously in such a way to where I was lost. And it was a part of my consciousness that knew that if my friends played this particular verse, it would be able to break through the clutter of my consciousness enough to where I could find my way back. So it's like sending a light through the darkness. So using sound to produce a light to find my way back to this reality and stuff. So this is a real live example of me having built a certain type of aspect to my soul experience that became useful from one world to the next, if you will. And so these saying, like, once I did have my first big out of body experience, it became apparent to me, like, right then and there, I had access to my full library of experience right in the single moment. So, like, from moment to moment, anything that I've seen, anything I've thought, anything I can imagine, I had it right there at my fingertip to be able to access and utilize. And it's just like, it's like being water at that point when you have no limitations as to what experience you can pull from and apply it. It reminds me of, like think about Space Jam, the scene on Space Jam where once it occurred to Michael that he was inside of a cartoon and had the same cartoon physics to draw from, he wins the game by stretching his arm out and flying slowly through the air. Whatever. It's like that times a million. Where if you can think it, it's possible. But then at the same time, unless you do the steps out here that are necessary for that to become part of you, integrated into your perception of self and everything else and soul experience, you may not think to use those things when you're out of your body. And so this is the importance of advancing and understanding this while you're in here with the limitations, such that you can program yourself to be able to utilize those stable actions and create those stable types of rules when you're in a state where you can virtually do anything. Because a lot of times, if you can do anything and everything, you may reach this point where you do nothing. And then, there's certain stories about certain species on a spiritual level who developed to a place like that, where they just, like, had seen and done everything, and then they just stood still, and it was just dreary and sad and all of that. And so this is the possibility that we present as human beings, because we always think outside of the box. And as a result, they say you can't take it with you. Well, you can't take anything material, but the experience you gain from your material experience does carry over to the soul level. So I'm going to leave it to you on that note, and we will continue kind of unraveling, kind of showing you the codes that are kind of driving the way reality has unfolded on a physical level. And by you reprogramming the way you psychologically interact with that thing by breaking it down to its universal form, which is numbers, really, then that gives you more degrees of freedom to be able to shape your reality in a way that actually works for everybody. You know what I'm saying? It becomes this thing we say, oh, okay, well, this is the face of the barn that I'm on, and this is the fires that I'm causing, so now I can stop trying to burn down the whole thing. Peace out, Michelle. I see you. But I will continue. After I go get Kalia in a little bit, I will resume in maybe about an hour or two. And then we will go to the board. I got a nice, lovely board prepared for y'all, and I'll be getting into those codes I said I would. But till next time, make sure you go back and watch the rest of it if you missed the rest of this one, and make sure you check out the other videos before that so you can get some background, and we'll keep it pushing, y'all. See you in the next one. Peace.